Hey everyone, I am back and hope you all had a Merry Christmas and a very happy holidays. In this video, this is a topic I've been thinking about and writing about for quite a while. So I've had this content and I finally was able to sit down and record it. I want to be talking about apologetics, and what I want to do is differentiate what I would say is apologetics practiced properly and apologetics practiced improperly. So when apologetics is discussed, usually the Bible verses that pop up are, 1 Peter 3:15 through 3:17, which says, in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. Now, the key word here is defense, which is directly translated from the Greek apologia, which refers to a reason, argument, or explanation. And this is the root of the term apologetics, which is the discipline of defending religious doctrines through systematic argumentation and discourse. As one source I was reading mentioned, quote, historically, this was vital for early Christians who needed to explain and justify their faith amidst skepticism and persecution. And sociologist and historian James Davison Hunter writes, quote, that Christianity became the object of criticism by the best philosophical minds of the day at the same time when Christians were forging an intellectual tradition of their own was a powerful factor in setting Christian thought on a sound course. So really, apologetics, it helped the early Christian church develop and thrive and these sorts of things. So this kind of apologetics of giving good reasons, arguing, defending, this is all well and good, right? I think it's good, not only good for others, but it's good for us as well. In fact, this is what I try to do. I mean, really, this is what the primary focus of my channel is. And while I've never really thought of myself as an apologist per se, I mean, I do make a lot of apologetics content. I mean, I realize I make a lot of other random videos too, but really the guiding telos of this channel is to really try and explain how I went from being skeptical of the core doctrines of Christianity to finding them actually believable and eventually believing them. However, I've noticed that this kind of idea of believability and reasonability, it can go too far. There are some Christians, I get the impression, feel the need to kind of overstate what the evidence is. And I'll get into more about why I think people feel the need to do this later. Some on YouTube are going to use clickbaity titles or use clickbaity video thumbnails. I'm not going to call out anyone on any side, but just look around and you'll see what I'm talking about. Others may dismiss or ridicule objections, which I think is particularly problematic if these objections or questions are legitimate and done in good faith. I mean, I have a lot of questions too, and I had a lot of questions. And if somebody had been really condescending to me when I was exploring or trying to have these questions answered, it really would have put me off. Apologetics, and I'm using this term in scare quotes, can end up becoming an offensive tactic rather than a defensive one. Now, of course, there are times a good offense is a good defense. And of course, it's perfectly fine for Christians to go on the offensive and criticize ideas, show certain things are ridiculous or lead to absurdities, things like that. But there are times apologetics can literally be offensive in a more pejorative sense in how it argues. And this offensiveness can actually betray the message of the gospel. And let me explain. So my goal as a Christian and as a researcher is to help people find truth. And this is truth with a sort of capital T, if you will. Now, I personally believe God is the source of all truth, so any act of seeking truth is also seeking God. But I also realize I have my own limits. I mean, I've been wrong about things, I've made mistakes, and I've also believed stuff in the past I no longer do. So any discussion or conversation I'm going to have with anyone really begins with the realization that I always have something to learn. I mean, if I can't learn something from somebody else, especially someone else who disagrees with me, that's my fault. I mean, that's my problem. As a result, why should I or any Christian who is subject to the same limitations of me feel the need to be dishonest or overstate anything in an argument? I mean, there are times we can use arguments, especially rehearsed ones, to actually keep from having to consider what someone else has to say. We can use it as a sort of guard as opposed to critically examining our own beliefs. So here's what philosopher Myron Penner writes in his book, The End of Apologetics. He writes, quote, evidence and arguments become a way for me to shield myself simultaneously from genuine personal engagement and self-examination in the encounter with the other, and to remove any threat to my beliefs and self-perception by transforming the other into my likeness. Now, if I'm being honest, I think Penner takes postmodernism a little too far, and I do think evidence and arguments can and do have their place. But I think he's right to point out that these things are tools, and they can be used for post hoc rationalization, and they can also be used as a weapon for ridicule and self-importance, which is, of course, a sin. So as Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 13:2, quote, if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith as to remove mountains, but I have not love, I am nothing. So let me give my definition of what I would call bad apologetics, or the apologetics in scare quotes. Bad apologetics uses arguments to score conversions. And notice the focus here on score. It's self-focused, it's selfish. Whereas good apologetics should be truth-focused, and I'd add primarily focused on others and not ourselves. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, everyone has a viewpoint, and I'd argue everyone should be allowed to make the best case for their view as possible. And this, of course, includes Christians and non-Christians as well. But what can happen is our goal no longer becomes being fair or accurate or honest. It simply becomes trying to win people to our side. And notice this kind of tribalistic side, us versus them mentality, which I think can be really, really dangerous. Put another way, good apologetics seeks to help people find truth, and whereas bad apologetics seeks to make people Christians. Now, every apologist out there hopefully believes Christianity is true. So shouldn't these two be the same thing? Not necessarily. If our goal is for people to find truth, and we believe Christianity is true, then helping people find truth will necessarily point them towards Christianity. But if our goal is instead to make people convert, then there can be dishonesty and all sorts of other unchristian things to do as a means to this end. And crucially, there's a difference between identifying as a Christian and actually being or living as a Christian that I think is really important to remember when thinking about these kinds of things. I mean, at least I try to keep that in mind. So here's an example of bad apologetics. Conversions by the sword, or sort of forced conversions. I mean, it's happened in history. And many of us today think this is wrong because it overrides some notion of freedom or dignity, that it's inherently coercive in nature. And I'm hoping that dishonest and manipulative apologetics will also go the way of history for the same reason, right? The issue in all these cases is a lack of respect for the person in question, for the role of the Spirit, and for logic and people's ability to use it. And let me give an example from perhaps the greatest evangelizer and apologist in history, the Apostle Paul. And I'm totally ripping this insight off of Chris C.A., the pastor of the church I go to, though it was from a slightly different context. So before Paul becomes a Christian, what is his way of dealing with people who disagree with them? And he tells us, right? Persecution, violence, having people put to death. This is how Saul treated Christians before becoming one. And what happens after he becomes a Christian? Well, the Bible tells us. In Acts 17:16, we hear that Paul goes to Athens, and we're told that he gets upset, and some translations say angered, by the idols that are all around the city. So here are some people he disagrees with, and maybe he's getting ready to crack some skulls like before. But this is not what he does. Instead, he reasons with them, and in the speech we find in verse 22, he starts by saying, quote, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, which were the things that made him angry, I found also an altar with the inscription, 'To the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you.'" So he literally starts out by finding common ground with people, recognizing that they're devout people, and he reasons with them, using their literature and what is already known to them to teach them about God and about Christianity. And in my own case, many of the arguments I find really compelling are those that incorporate things I've already have experience with, such as those involving mathematics and topics from computer science, because those are the fields I have training in. So really, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, I don't know, or let me think about that, rather than giving some knee-jerk reaction or some quip. I mean, the goal, in my view, should be honesty. And the issue here that I'm trying to call out here in bad apologetics is that I see some Christians who I really believe are dishonest. Maybe not intentionally, but in their actions or demeanor. It's almost like they're trying to convince themselves that what they're saying is true. I mean, they claim to be speaking truth, but they're actually betraying it in how they argue. I mean, that's what I would say. Now, here's a hot take. If more Christians were prudent about their claims, there wouldn't be a need for counter-apologetics. There wouldn't be a need for skeptics to constantly debunk religious claims, and atheists who are on the more offensive side wouldn't have as much ammunition to ridicule Christianity. As it stands, I'm glad there are people like Joe Schmidt and Emerson Green who can do this job, though perhaps it would be good if Christians took on this job too. And I do realize there are many, many Christians who are prudent and self-reflective, so don't take what I'm saying too far. I don't mean to sort of ignore any of that. I understand there are a lot of great people out there. I just don't think they always get the attention they deserve given the kind of context that these debates happen in. But really, I think it's important to be self-reflective and to be honest about the limits of certain arguments we have. Now, to be fair, I'd agree that many skeptics also argue using dishonest and manipulative tactics. I mean, don't even get me started on some of the censorship and intimidation I've seen from so-called free thinkers. And even some of my favorite agnostics and atheists who I watch do this too, where it's clear from the title or the goal of their video that it's to get clicks and views, not to be as charitable or as fair as possible. Again, I'm not going to name any names, but just look around and hopefully you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. But at the same time, I don't know if I can blame them that much, given that there are Christians who do this as well. And really, I'm going to be much harder on the Christians who do this because, quite frankly, we're instructed to do better and we believe we're called to a higher standard. Now, of course, Jesus tells us to treat others the way we want to be treated. So I cringe when I see Christians kind of use the "well, they do it too" as an excuse to be manipulative, condescending, or self-righteous. And as a Christian, I really do not see how this can fly. Not only is this a tu quoque fallacy, but the behavior of other people, especially non-Christians, is not an excuse for our own behavior. I mean, after all, whose example is it we're claiming to follow? Jesus or non-Christians? Now, I think a lot of this stuff from both Christians and non-Christians, when we see these kind of bad apologetics, really does come from a place of fear. I think we become afraid that us or our arguments won't be taken seriously or seriously enough if we don't word them strong enough. Or perhaps we feel the need to word our arguments in such a strong way to get them a fair hearing. And I think the first thing to realize is, as Christians, we're not given a spirit of fear. And I think primarily our goal when having a discussion should not primarily be sort of effectiveness or conversions, especially if this has to be achieved via dishonest means. I mean, Jesus tells us to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, right? Not seek maximal conversions by any means necessary. And I highly doubt that dishonesty has a place in the kingdom of God. And furthermore, kind of what does it say about our confidence in the reality or rationality of God if we have to turn to such tactics? I mean, it makes it seem like we don't think the evidence is enough to convince people. So it's kind of like saying, look, I don't think God provided enough evidence or reasons to believe in him, so I'll need to make up some to make it sound more compelling. I mean, it almost seems like less like faith and more like a lack of faith when people kind of feel the need to do this. Now, again, I've never really encountered an apologist, I would say, is actively lying to try and win people for Jesus, right? You hear these accusations that some people are lying for Jesus or some people are lying for atheism. And these slogans can be unhelpful because I think many people at least believe they're being truthful, at least literally. But I would encourage us to go farther. And my question is not whether someone is, refusing from lying, but are we being honest and fair? This is kind of, the spirit versus the letter of the law kind of distinction. And this is a crucial distinction because I can be dishonest and unfair while never actually uttering a lie. I mean, I can resort to fallacious arguments without necessarily uttering anything false. I can commit a lie by omission or by failing to do my due diligence, understanding, or responding to an objection. And I think this is a huge issue that we as Christians need to avoid. So if you have trouble seeing what I'm saying, consider the opposition we often see to things like astrology by so-called, scientific skeptics. Now, here's what philosopher of science Paul Feyerabend wrote in his book, Science in a Free Society, referring to an article titled Statement of 186 Scientists Against Astrology. This is from the September-October issue of 1975 of The Humanist. And this is what Feyerabend writes. Now, what surprises the reader whose image of science has been formed by the customary eulogies which emphasize rationality, objectivity, impartiality, and so on, is the religious tone of the document, the illiteracy of the arguments, and the authoritarian manner in which the arguments are being presented. The learned gentlemen have strong convictions. They use their authority to spread these convictions. Why 186 signatures if one is arguments? They know a few phrases which sound like arguments, but they certainly do not know what they're talking about. And Feyerabend, really interestingly, he compares this to a 1484 textbook on witchcraft, kind of similar to the astrology piece offered by the Catholic Church. I mean, he continues, quote, in 1484, the Roman Catholic Church published the Malleus Maleficarum, the outstanding textbook on witchcraft. The Malleus is a very interesting book, and he goes on to kind of describe the book. But basically what he writes is, quote, the description of phenomena is sufficiently detailed to enable us to identify the mental disturbances that accompanied some cases. The etiology is pluralistic. There is not just the official explanation. There are other explanations as well, purely materialistic explanations included. Of course, in the end, only one of the offered explanations is accepted, but the alternatives are discussed, and so one can judge the arguments that led to their elimination. This feature makes the Malleus superior to almost every physics, biology, chemistry textbook of today. Even the theology is pluralistic. Heretical views are not passed over in silence, nor are they ridiculed. They are described, examined, and removed by argument. The authors know the subject, they know their opponents, they give a correct account of the positions of their opponents, they argue against these positions, and they use the best knowledge available at the time in their arguments. Comparing the Malleus with accounts of contemporary knowledge, the reader can easily verify that the Pope and his learned authors knew what they were talking about. This cannot be said of our scientists, and he's talking about the scientists that wrote this thing. They neither know the subject they attack, astrology, nor those parts of their own science that undermine their attack. Now, Feyerabend's point about how even the very people who claim to represent rationality and objectivity can betray these ideas is really well taken. And I think what accounts for such poor argumentation is a desire to manipulate and control, not help others find truth. I mean, more fundamentally, what separates the scientist Feyerabend is criticizing and the Catholic Church in this passage is contempt. Ironically, the scientists mentioned feel the public is incapable of understanding the arguments, or they just simply don't care whether they understand them or not, because their goal is not understanding. If they aren't lying for naturalism or lying for skepticism, they're certainly being dishonest on its behalf. Whereas the Catholic Church in this passage not only sees its readers as capable, but in Feyerabend's view is actively trying to help them come to truth. So again, I think really this idea of helping people come to truth should be the primary goal here, not just sort of apologetic effectiveness, as in the quantity of people who convert. Some Christians have even argued that God needs to provide a certain epistemic distance from us to preserve our free will. And consider what theologian Brad Kallenberg said. He says, quote, "The rejectability of the gospel is ironically what prevents it from becoming mere propaganda. Consequently, the good news cannot be fully understood as good news unless the gospel is offered in non-coercive ways." In the end, I'd encourage Christians who are engaged in apologetics to be honest and direct, and this is for two reasons. The first reason is it's healthy for us to develop humility and self-reflection and to just say, I don't know, rather than to BS. It's fine to just say, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. Let me think about it and get back to you. And if someone doesn't want to accept that, that's their problem. It's not your problem. If someone is only going to listen to your argument if you dress it up with fancy rhetoric or use big words, again, that's their problem. That's not your problem. If they think you not having an immediate answer is a reason to sort of ridicule or dismiss you, they're the ones engaging in fallacious reasoning. And it's up to you and your judgment whether or not to call them on it or whether or not to continue engaging. For me, whenever I think someone is just so fundamentally misguided that I need to, teach them a lesson, it really puts me in a dangerous place of self-righteousness, and I get tempted by pride. And some people are probably really good and really well suited for this kind of thing and teaching people in these areas. I am just not there yet. The second thing is being honest and practicing restraint can actually be more compelling and effective than not doing so. And there's kind of an irony in this fact, right? It's like the Philosopher's Stone from Harry Potter, where you end up being more effective by not trying to greedily optimize effectiveness. And perhaps this is again what Jesus meant by saying, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. But I think there's a good reason for this, right? If I'm honest and I practice restraint when talking with someone, they can let their guard down a little bit because they know that I'm on their side, so to speak. They may not feel the need to be skeptical about every little thing I say if they know I've done my research and I'm willing to say I don't know when I actually don't know. And I think this is key, right? When I encounter someone who pretends they have all the answers and I catch them being wrong about something, it shakes my trust in pretty much everything they've said. And then, I need to fact check them because I can't trust them to do it themselves. More importantly, I think practicing restraint and charity allows others to see me as someone to learn from, rather than someone trying to manipulate them or get them to believe something so I can use them in some way. I really think there are a lot of people out there who've had bad experiences with organized religion or with Christianity where, and this is a view I used to have, that, this whole thing is just a tool for manipulation or propaganda or these other sorts of things. So coming from that standpoint, I think it's really important for people to see us as allies in helping them find truth rather than us trying to use them. And I think it comes down to our methodology and how we argue our point. Now, to be honest, I struggle with this a lot. I can be really combative, and there are times I'll look at comments on YouTube and get this desire to really dismantle what someone's saying or show they're wrong or contradicting themselves. And, I can get this idea of I know I can do it, and I'm really tempted to do it. And I know I can hurt their pride, and I think that this is something that needs to be done, but it's not healthy for me because I realize I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it so that I feel better, I feel smarter than them. And as a result, I work and I pray to try and be charitable and to not do this. A lot of the time I'll just simply ignore the comments where I'm tempted to respond this way. My thought is, look, if I think they're so wrong about something, then someone else can teach them or they'll have to figure it out themselves. I don't need to be the person to teach everyone everything. If I really thought so, that'd be really, really prideful. And of course, I still mess up all the time, though I do think I've gotten a lot better at this over the last few years with just quite frankly practice. The other thing I think is I used to feel threatened when people disagreed with me about things. And this wasn't even necessarily in matters of religion. It's just across the board. And I think letting go of that and letting go of needing to be right and instead just focusing on like, what can I learn from this person? What can I learn from what they're saying? This has opened me up to the value of listening to different perspectives. And I came up with this mantra, which is, to be correct, you must give up needing to be right. Right? In other words, to really find truth, we often need to humble ourselves and be open to being wrong. And I'd go so far as to argue the world is set up in such a way as to teach us humility in this regard. Though, of course, as a Christian, I'd say, God designed the world this way to teach us this kind of humility. And one of the things that I think is helpful is to remember that learning is a collaborative activity. I mean, have you ever tried to have a conversation with somebody who thinks they know all the answers? Someone who claims they're open-minded, but in reality, they've already decided that they're right and everyone else is wrong. I mean, these people are insufferable. Again, if you're having a conversation with someone you disagree with and you can't learn anything from them, I think that's your problem. Though I guess I'm open to being wrong about that too. And I'd also say you don't have to be persuaded in someone else's argument for a conversation to be worthwhile or educational. You may learn a new perspective or a new way of seeing things. And some of this begins with not seeing others as filled with ideas to be shot down, but instead as just people to be loved or understood. And the last thing I'll say is that I think Reformed epistemology, and I've done a few videos on this, offers a way of avoiding the sort of apologetic positivism that has come to characterize what Penner calls the apologetics industrial complex, right? I think Reformed epistemology finds this nice middle ground between the sort of incoherence of evidentialism without giving into fideism and needing everything, to be based on faith and not based on reasons or arguments or things like that. As Penner writes, quote, reason's function then is to not ground our truths, but to explain them. Reason depends on a logically prior truth with a capital T to situate it. So anyway, these have been kind of my thoughts, and hopefully you found them helpful. I'm curious to hear what you guys think. If you guys have any reactions, agreements, or disagreements, let me know in the comments. I'll try to be around. And as always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.